Back live tonight on In Focus, and thanks for staying on. South Africans could be in for a big rise in electricity prices. The National Energy Regulator of South Africa is reportedly working on a cost-reflective model which could see hikes if approved. Eskom also applied for a 38% price increase under the old tariff model. Independent economic and energy analyst Tshepo Kgadima joins us now for more. Good evening, and thank you very much for your time. Is the current method of managing energy availability of Eskom going to come back to bite us, as NERSA would want to then do this cost-reflective price increase? In other words, the much diesel that we are burning is going to come back to bite us as taxpayers having to pay more for electricity.
Yeah, look, I think, the NERSA model is fundamentally flawed, particularly the so-called cost-reflective tariff. It does not take into account that who determines the cost. And the cost is certainly not determined even by Eskom. The cost is determined by outsiders. Now, Eskom on its own, and because of its size, it should have been a price not a price taker, meaning it doesn't have to accept any price that comes to it from its suppliers. But now we have this situation where we have seen, inexplicably, the cost of feedstock, such as coal, the cost of the so-called independent power producers, and of course the unwarranted use of diesel have added cost which could have been avoided. And we sit now in a situation where, as the tariffs continue to increase, taking into account that in the last 10 years we've had well over 750% tariff increase. Now this new tariff that Eskom is demanding to have the so-called cost-reflective tariff will bring the tariff increases in a space of 10 to 11 years to just under 1,000%. There is no economy that has ever survived. Hence, we are going to see more municipalities failing to service their debt with Eskom for the electricity. And also we are going to see households now rather seeking alternative sources of electricity away from Eskom, because, by the way, the government under Minister Gwede Mantashe, they have inadvertently liberalized and deregulated the electricity market. So what we are going to see is that Eskom is in fact going to be in a more serious problem of not being able, because as the tariffs are that much higher, there will be much less demand for electricity from Eskom, because users of electricity will have found alternative sources. So effectively we are going to see a Eskom that is bankrupt. Hence it should not even surprise us that now at this hour the audited financial statements of Eskom have not been released because it's actually insolvent. So the tariff increase, of course, is going to have a direct bearing on consumers, and including households, the domestic user, but at the same time will only exacerbate the financial problems that Eskom finds itself in.
So you're saying the current situation of, for example, not having money to purchase diesel is not a temporary challenge. It's actually indicative of a much deeper concerning issue around the liquidity of Eskom that should worry South Africans.
Indeed, but it also shows you that you have management that is completely out of depth, not understanding. It is not feasible to produce electricity from diesel, because electricity from diesel is priced in US dollars. And South Africa now imports all refined petroleum because we have shut down the refineries that we had. Now, all the diesel that is burnt at particularly the two main peaking power stations, what they call the OCGT, the Gorikwa and Ankerleg, the cost there is around 50 US cents per kilowatt hour, whereas Eskom is able to produce electricity from coal for 3 US cents a kilowatt hour. So the math can never make sense to say you are now spending 50 cents instead of spending 3 cents US per kilowatt hour to produce electricity. So it's a zero-sum game. The 19 billion, which we are meant to believe that Eskom has now demanded from Treasury is going to be wasteful and fruitless expenditure, when actually Eskom should have been concerned with the main business of Eskom, producing baseload power, and the only viable source of baseload power in South Africa is coal. Everything should have been done to ensure that we produce the least cost electricity from coal, but do it in an environmentally sustainable manner by deploying higher efficiency, lower emissions, clean coal technologies. And that is the only viable route for South Africa for us to go, because when you are adding on more intermittent energy sources such as wind and solar, you increase the strain on the grid. So effectively the grid will have a much higher risk of collapse, but the tariffs also are going to increase. And what is that based on? It's based on objective evidence from the United Kingdom, from Germany, from the United States, specifically Texas and California. The tariffs have gone so much higher that those economies are now suffering. And they have got inflation, they have got the UK, for example, in a span of 10 years, 20,000 people died because they could not afford electricity, particularly heating costs. And that is what we are going to be faced with in South Africa, that people will no longer be able to afford baseload power, or rather electricity that is supplied by Eskom, and they have to find the alternatives. But the alternatives are themselves so bad. So we're going to have a double blow in that Eskom will continue to be in a financially precarious position that it currently is in, whilst at the same time, the consumers of electricity, those that can, their cost of production for businesses to run, because they will be using generators or having had to install the solar on their rooftop, because solar works off grid, not on grid. But the domestic consumers themselves are not going to be able to afford. So it is a double blow to the economy of South Africa. But this means Eskom will certainly go bankrupt, because NERSA has failed in its duty as an independent regulator.
So are you saying, for example, Eskom relies on these tariff hikes to be able to recoup from any under recovery? Are you saying the more these big players, big industries who can afford are moving themselves off the grid and being able to produce their own, because of what you call the inadvertent deregulation of energy production in the country, would eventually end up in a space where Eskom is unable to recoup?
Oh, most certainly. We're going to have an Eskom that whatever electricity it produces, it will have no customer. Or the customers are going to be so few that it will not be able to actually stay afloat, be a going concern, as currently is the case. Because if you take over the last 5 years, we have seen year after year the electricity sales from Eskom going lower and lower. And it will not be surprising. Now, when you have got load shedding, rolling blackouts as we currently have, because every time there's any stage of load shedding, it means Eskom loses revenue to the tune of between 60 and 160 million rand in that day, depending on which stage of load shedding they actually have implemented. So they not only lose revenue from load shedding, the rolling blackouts, but at the same time, because the consumers of electricity from the unreliability of Eskom have now found alternatives, and even with the domestic customers, the households, which account for 44.9% of Eskom's income, they themselves are now using alternative sources. For example, I am talking to you this evening. The lighting that I'm using is all solar lighting and off-grid. So more and more people are going that route, and I'm using solar lighting because I'm in a load shedding. So those are the things that I'm talking about, that you will have a Eskom that it doesn't matter what tariff they demand, what increase they get, they will not be able to sell enough volume of electricity in order to stay afloat, which in turn means that you will have to have National Treasury to continue bailing Eskom out. And I will not be surprised if when at the end of December, when Eskom releases its long-awaited audited financial statements, that the bailout from Treasury for this past financial year will be in the order of 70 billion rand. Because if they don't get that bailout, then they will be insolvent, which means that they will default on their debt, the various bonds that they've issued, taking into account that the JSE has already issued another warning to Eskom that failure to release the audited financial statements will result in Eskom bonds being delisted. And that, in turn, means that you default. And when you default, all other state-owned companies, it means they will be found to be in a state of default. So Treasury will have to come up with over 780 billion rand to sort out the mess that will result from Eskom being in default. So these are very difficult issues, and Eskom should have known better. Eskom should stay the lowest cost producer of electricity, which is renowned and reputed for. And the best way to do that is simply returning back to the basics. Use coal, but use coal in a manner where you can burn it much more cleaner, because the alternative, where people are using alternative fuels, is only also going to contribute to the environmental degradation, as people will be using coal, cow dung, and all other fuels for domestic heating, whereas businesses will also be using diesel and others, and therefore increasing the pollution that will result from such uses of fuel. Eskom must stick to the knitting. The basics is that it is an electricity supply commission. It must use viable sources of power generation. And that, for South Africa, is coal and then, of course, nuclear. But nuclear is a long-term solution. It's not an immediate solution. But this tariff increase, I can assure you, is going to be one more nail in the coffin of Eskom, because they just simply, people will not be able to afford, and therefore will not be able to realize payments. Take into account, Eskom says that they've got $50 billion that is owed by the municipalities. But in terms of the accounting rules, they actually have to write off 35 billion of that, which means they can never ever recoup it under any circumstances whatsoever. So why would you demand a further tariff increase of that nature when the evidence is all for them to see as the people who are running the enterprise?
So, apart from the tariff increase, it's also a whole tariff structure that is being introduced here. I mean, does it really make any difference in terms of their adequate recovery? For example, the introduction of what they call a single energy charge, an ancillary charge, as well as a network demand charge.
Yeah, I mean, that is absurdity. And I am astonished, actually, because the new chair of NERSA is somebody that I've got a high regard for, somebody who understands energy and understands Eskom. So the question becomes, who is leaning on the regulator to actually now go and formulate such a very bizarre tariff structure, tariff determination structure? Because electricity doesn't matter what time of the day you produce it, the cost is exactly the same. And because when you put it onto the grid, there is a time where you have to run. You can't be running your boilers, ramping them up and down based on demand. You have to run your boilers at all material times to ensure that you achieve great stability. Because that is really the design, the architecture of South Africa's electricity system. It requires baseload power, nothing else. Now, on that basis alone, there can be no justification whatsoever to have that differentiation in tariff. Because the moment you introduce that differentiation in tariff, you end up with a zero-sum game, because at the time when the tariff is the highest, there just simply is not going to be any demand, so you will not be able to realize income. And at the time that your tariff is also the lowest, also again, is the time when there's naturally no demand whatsoever, because the higher the tariff is, it makes alternatives viable. So therefore, the consumers of electricity will make sure that they will only draw electricity at the off-peak period. But during on-peak period, they will be using alternatives, because the alternatives will be much cheaper than Eskom-derived electricity. And on that basis alone, it means that you have an enterprise here that will not be financially viable, but that the architects of that insolvency of Eskom are actually the management, and unfortunately now assisted by NERSA, which, as I say, have utterly failed in their duty to be an independent regulator who should have acted responsibly, particularly as the economy of South Africa is desperately in need of interventions that can help us to achieve energy security, because from energy security, you can talk about economic growth. If you've got energy insecurity, there can be no economic growth to speak of whatsoever, because there's no example of any country in the world that ever sustainably grew with being energy insecure.
Independent economic and energy analyst Tshepo Kgadima, appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on tonight.